Picture this: no lights, no street lamps casting orange pools on wet pavement, no phone screen, no faint blue glow from the neighbor's window across the street, no lights anywhere on the planet. Just darkness. The kind so complete it has weight. The kind where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face, no matter how long you wait for your eyes to adjust. The kind your brain doesn't quite know what to do with because your brain has never actually experienced it. That was every night your ancestors ever lived through, every single one. From the moment your species first looked like your species, roughly 300,000 years ago, until the last few hundred years, the sun went down and the world disappeared. There was no switching it back on. And here's what makes it stranger. The dark wasn't safe. The sounds you heard at night, the low cough of something large nearby, the crunch of something shifting its weight in the dry grass, the long rising howl that carried across miles of open plain, those sounds meant something real. They still do, somewhere in your nervous system, even when your logical brain knows you're in a house with locked doors and no predators for 100 miles. The sun goes down. The world your species spent all day reading and navigating just vanishes. Something moves out there. Something breathes. And you have hours to fill before sunrise. What did they actually do? We tend to imagine prehistoric sleep as simple. Exhausted bodies collapsing into a cave, unconscious until dawn. The night as a gap between one day and the next, spent completely checked out, inert, unimportant. But it wasn't like that. The more researchers have dug into the archaeology of night, the fire pits, the layered sleeping sites, the residue in burned plant material, the wear patterns on stone tools found alongside charred bone, the more that darkness fills up with life, with deliberate, careful, unmistakably human activity. Here's what changes everything. Night might have been the most important part of the day. Not because of what came out in the dark, but because of what the darkness made possible. For hundreds of thousands of years, the hours after sunset were when your species did something no other animal on Earth was doing. They talked. They made meaning together. They built the invisible scaffolding of culture, the stories, the rituals, the shared beliefs that let strangers trust each other. And they did it by firelight, in the hours between dark and dawn. Before agriculture, before cities, before writing. There were already people sitting in the dark, close enough to feel each other's warmth, telling each other things that mattered, things about people who weren't in the room, things that hadn't happened yet, things that already had. And the foundation of all of it, before the fire, before the stories, was something almost absurdly ordinary. The bed. Your ancestors were remarkably deliberate about where and how they slept. We tend to picture prehistoric sleep as improvised, bodies curled on bare rock, heads resting on bundled animal skins. But the physical evidence tells a more careful story. In 2011, archaeologists at Sibudu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, found the oldest known sleeping mats in human history, dated to 77,000 years ago. 50,000 years earlier than any previous evidence for constructed bedding. They were built from compacted layers of sedge stems, rushes, and grass, stacked up to 3 meters thick in places, laid down and rebuilt by successive generations using the same cave over tens of thousands of years. Not a pile of leaves, a made bed, maintained across generations with obvious intention. What made the discovery particularly striking was the plant selection. The dominant species in the oldest layer, Cryptocarya woodi, a relative of the camphor tree, produces aromatic chemicals that naturally repel insects, mosquitoes, fleas, midges. These people had identified over time that specific plants made sleep safer and more comfortable, and they chose those plants deliberately. Starting around 73,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Sibudu began burning the old mats periodically, then laying fresh material on top of the ash. The researchers believe this was intentional pest control. Fire used to sanitize a sleeping surface that had accumulated insects and parasites over months of use. Clean the slate, start again. The site preserves at least 15 distinct bedding layers, 15 rounds of building, using, burning, and rebuilding. 15 generations of people who cared enough about the quality of their rest to maintain a deliberate practice around it. Who understood that burning the old bed and building a new one would help? Who passed that knowledge on? 77,000 years ago, in a limestone cave above a South African river, someone was teaching someone else how to make a better bed. Think about that for a moment. Not hunting, not tool making, not fire, sleep. The most basic, most animal thing a body does. And your ancestors were already refining it, systematizing it, passing the method down. Rest wasn't just collapse, it was craft. Tonight you'll straighten the sheets before you get in. You'll find the cool side of the pillow. You'll arrange the duvet so it's just right. That instinct is at least 77,000 years old. Probably much older. We just don't have the evidence yet for how much older. Here's something that fundamentally changes how you understand ancient sleep. Not everyone was ever asleep at the same time, not by accident. By biology, a feature of human variation that turns out to be an elegant solution to a problem no one had to consciously design. In 2017, David Sampson and colleagues at Duke University published a study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. They tracked the sleep patterns of the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last groups living in a traditional hunter-gatherer way. Participants wore sleep monitoring devices for 20 consecutive days. Researchers logged who was awake, who was asleep, and when. The question: how often was the entire adult group asleep simultaneously? Almost never. In 220 hours of nighttime data, there were just 18 minutes in which every adult was asleep at the same time. 18 minutes out of 220 hours. The reason is chronotype. Human beings are not synchronized sleepers. Some fall asleep early and wake early. Some stay up late. Most fall somewhere between. And crucially, this variation appears to be a selected for trait. Because when you mix chronotypes in a group, you never reach a moment when everyone is at their deepest sleep phase simultaneously. Someone is always lighter. Someone is always closer to waking. Older adults compound this further. Elderly people sleep shorter and lighter. In the Hadza data, grandparents were dramatically more likely to be awake during the small hours than younger adults. Sampson's team called this the poorly sleeping grandparent hypothesis. Elderly group members didn't just provide value during the day, they served as passive nighttime sentinels, their biologically lighter sleep making them most likely to catch an unusual sound before it became a threat. Lions approach silently. Leopards don't announce themselves. A group in which someone is always at a light sleep stage is a group with a continuous, built-in early warning system. That feeling of waking at 3 a.m., alert, uneasy, listening for something you can't name, that's not a malfunction. That's the system running its original program in a world where the threats it evolved to detect no longer exist. Humans controlled fire at least 400,000 years ago. Evidence from Sibudu Cave in Israel shows burned bone and ash in structured deposits indicating regular, managed fire use. Wonderwork Cave in South Africa contains traces of burned bone and plant matter, dated to nearly 1 million years. The standard story about fire focuses on cooking. Cooked food is more digestible. More digestible food meant more available energy. More energy went to the brain, bigger brains, smarter humans. That's all true. But it misses something equally transformative. Fire extended the day. Before fire, darkness was a hard boundary. The predators that hunt at night, lions, leopards, hyenas, have eyes built for low light. Your ancestors, with primate vision tuned for daylight, were genuinely vulnerable after dark. Moving around, doing anything useful, venturing far from shelter, all of it became dangerous the moment the light failed. Fire changed that. It added roughly 4 hours of usable time to every evening. 4 hours of light, warmth, and relative safety. 4 hours in which the group could remain active and social long after every other primate on the continent had gone still. Multiply 4 hours by 365 nights by thousands of years. That's an enormous accumulation of time that no other hominid had. Time that had to be filled with something. Fire also reshaped the geometry of threat. Large predators are deeply reluctant to approach open flame. A maintained fire in the center of camp created a real perimeter. It defined an inside and an outside. The darkness beyond the fire became something you could see from, rather than something that could approach your camp unseen. Inside that ring of orange light, with the grass receding into a wall of darkness rather than being a potential source of approach, something in human attention shifted. You could look at the person across the fire. You could watch their face. You could follow the arc of their voice without also scanning the horizon with half your brain. And in that specific quality of directed inward attention, something became possible that changed the species permanently. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner spent decades living with and studying the Juhuan Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. She first visited in the 1970s, recording conversations across camps in the region. She returned in 1998, 2005, and 2013, building a dataset that spanned nearly 40 years. In 2014, she published a landmark paper in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, comparing the content of daytime and nighttime conversation in the same communities. The contrast was stark. Daytime talk centered on practical, immediate concerns. Who had shared food fairly? Land rights, complaints about specific individuals, economic disputes. The social friction of people living in close proximity with limited supplies. Useful, necessary talk, but entirely focused on the local and the immediate. Then the sun went down. Around the fire, the content shifted entirely. 81% of nighttime firelight conversation was stories, myths and folk tales passed down through generations. Accounts of people in distant camps, hundreds of miles away, whom listeners had never met. Tales of ancestors, narratives involving spirit beings, jokes, performances. The full exercise of human imagination directed outward, beyond the firelight, into time and distance. There is something about fire in the middle of the darkness, Wiessner wrote, that bonds, mellows, and excites people. Here's why the content matters. The people in those distant camps, described in stories, given names and histories and reputations, were strangers. Your immediate band might number 30 or 40 people, but the extended network of people you knew through story could number several hundred. And crucially, you could extend trust to them, cooperate with them during hard seasons, trade, marry into their families, because you had a working model of who they were before you ever met them. Stories were a technology for distributing knowledge about people and places beyond the limits of direct experience. They were how your species built social networks at a scale impossible for an animal living in small mobile groups. The campfire was the original social network. Information moved through it. Reputations traveled. Cultural rules were transmitted not through formal instruction, but through stories told at night to people who were relaxed, attentive, and not thinking about tomorrow's hunt. And the charismatic storyteller, the person whose voice could hold a circle of tired adults in unforced attention, was among the most important members of any group. Not the strongest, not the fastest, the one who could make the dark feel full rather than empty. Every human culture that has ever existed has its storytellers. Every society has its myths. Now you know where that begins. Around a fire, in the dark. At the precise moment when the day's urgencies had finally let go. But the fire only pushed the darkness back so far. Beyond its edge, the night was still out there. Your ancestors knew what lived in that darkness. The low cough of a leopard that seems to come from every direction at once. Impossible to locate. The hyena's laugh. Unsettlingly like a human voice, carrying for miles across open ground. The rustle in dry grass that could be wind or could be something moving with deliberate care. Fear of the night is not irrational. For most of human existence, something really was out there. The darkness beyond the firelight wasn't metaphorical danger. It was a real space where real predators made real decisions. And that fear, sustained over hundreds of thousands of years, became something more structured. It became the supernatural. Consider the pattern. Across cultures with no possible contact, separated by oceans, mountain ranges, 10,000 years of independent development, the same structures appear. The dead are active at night. The boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond opens after dark. Dreams are transmissions from ancestors or spirits. Witches and hostile forces operate specifically between sunset and dawn. This isn't coincidence. It's the formalization of a very old and very rational fear. Night was genuinely dangerous. The invisible world, the space beyond where firelight reached, was literally the place from which death could arrive. Religion, in this reading, is partly an attempt to negotiate with that space, to populate it with known entities, given names and rules and conditions, rather than leave it as pure threatening unknown. And dreams, those emotionally overwhelming, convincingly real experiences arriving in the hours of deepest sleep, were not dismissed by any culture that ever left a record. Every human society interpreted dreams as meaningful, as contact, as information from somewhere beyond the ordinary. Not one culture in all of recorded history decided that dreams simply don't matter. Your ancestors didn't just endure the night, they populated it with meaning, and in doing so, they made it survivable. Tonight you'll close the blinds, turn on a lamp, and scroll through a glowing screen until your body forces you under. Or you'll fall asleep to a podcast, the sound of someone else's voice filling the silence so you don't have to experience it directly. You will spend almost no time in actual quiet. You will almost certainly never experience real darkness in your entire life. Most people alive today never will. Your ancestors sat at the edge of a fire with the night enormous around them, and so they turned toward each other. Not because they were more evolved or more naturally communal, but because the alternative was sitting alone in the dark, and human beings have never been good at that. Because the darkness pressed in from every direction, and the only thing that made it bearable was knowing that someone else was in it with you. They held the night together. They filled it with stories and fire and the sound of other people breathing nearby. They faced its full weight, the predators at the perimeter, the cold at the edges of the firelight, the strange half-world of half-sleep and watchfulness, in company. And inside that shared discomfort, over thousands of years, something was built. Trust at a scale that changed the species. A language rich enough to describe things not yet present. A sense of being part of something larger than the immediate camp. We traded that for the light switch, for the phone. For the modern achievement of never having to sit in the dark, never having to reach toward another person because the alternative is genuinely frightening. The night used to cost something. It demanded your attention, your company, your imagination. It forced you into proximity with other people whether you wanted it or not. And somewhere in that forced proximity, something good happened. Something that can't quite be replicated in daylight, in comfort, with nowhere to be and nothing pressing in from the edges. Now the night is just the time between charging your phone and falling asleep. The last fire your species ever truly needed to survive was lit sometime in the last few hundred years, when electricity made darkness optional for the first time in 300,000 years of human history. Before that, on every continent, in every climate, every human being who ever lived watched the same thing unfold every night without exception. The fire burned lower. The embers went from orange to deep red to gray. The darkness at the edge of camp pressed a little closer. And someone stayed awake. Someone fed the fire. Someone kept watch so the others could sleep. Every person who ever loved someone. Every person who told a story that made a tired group laugh. Every person who ever woke in the small hours with their heart beating too fast, listening hard into a silence that felt almost, but not quite, empty. They all sat in the same dark. They all watched the same embers. They all kept the same vigil that no one assigned them and no one could take over. Maybe you still do. Those nights you wake at 3 a.m., alert, certain for just a moment that something is there. Not imagining it, not dreaming, just listening the way something in you has always known how to listen. That's not insomnia. That's memory. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and join us for more ancient history videos, explained through simple visuals and brought to life one story at a time.